What if I told you there was a Gorilla Tag player who died in VR? There are lots of very creepy ghost stories like this in Gorilla Tag. So in this video, I'm going to cover all of the disturbing ghost stories like this. In early 2022, a player was just randomly joining public lobbies. This player's username was FlameGT, but one of these public lobbies were very weird. Another player in the lobby was telling everyone if you join the code RUNEXE, you will get kicked out of the game. People assumed he was lying because they'd never heard of this before, but FlameGT decided he wanted to test this out. So he walked over to the computer, left the lobby, and began to type in this code. Remember, this was early 2022, so there weren't nearly as many ghosts as there are in the game now. So something like this was very rare. When he clicked enter, something very weird happened. Just like the player said, he got kicked out of the game for no reason. But this isn't the scariest part. When he loaded back in, something was off. He noticed the computer said there were 0 players online. This is a pretty normal glitch in Gorilla Tag, but when he tried to use the computer, none of the buttons on the computer seemed to work. This confused him, so he tried joining a public lobby, but it still wouldn't let him join. He was stuck in Gorilla Tag, completely alone. He explored forest for a while, not understanding what was going on, until he suddenly noticed something. While standing at the stump entrance, he saw a player standing at gazebo. Something was not right here. He wasn't in a lobby, but somehow there was a player right there looking up at him. So he called out to it, but the player didn't respond. So he tried walking over to it, but this was a big mistake, because as soon as he did, he got kicked out of the game again. Now, he didn't play the game for the rest of the day, but when he got back on the next day, everything was normal. Before I move on to the next story, shout out to my last 5 subscribers. If you want to be in the next video, then subscribe. This next story is about a player called VRPlayer100. He was playing in casual lobbies, just practicing different skills, until he joined a code with him and one other player. The player was a salmon-coloured monkey, walking back and forth across the bridge. This was already very weird, but this gets even weirder. This player was repeating some kind of chant, in a very deep, raspy voice. At this point, VRPlayer was very confused, so he cautiously approached this player. When he got to the bridge, he asked the player what he was doing. Then the player stopped moving, and as it turned to look at him, VRPlayer suddenly got kicked. And when he loaded back into Gorilla Tag, he got hit with the famous cursed loading screen. When he finally loaded into Stump, he was banned for a day. This is the story of the Gorilla Tag Ghost PBBV, the first ever Gorilla Tag ghost. The next story is about a player and his friend, in the code Mirror Man. They started by just playing tag in forest, but then they decided to go to city, just to try on some cosmetics. But when they got to the mirror, they noticed something very creepy. They both saw a face in the mirror, but this wasn't just a normal face. Apparently it had a creepy smile, which isn't possible in Gorilla Tag. Then they both suddenly started glitching, and then they started getting pulled into the mirror. At this point, both their screens were glitching like crazy. Once their screens were done glitching, they weren't in city anymore. They got pulled inside the mirror. When they looked around, they appeared to be in some kind of humanoid room. At this point, they were very confused, and they had no idea what was going on. But standing in front of them, in this dark humanoid room, was Mirror Man. It was standing in front of them speaking in Morse code, which translated to the words, "You're trapped." At this point, the two players had been completely separated. When this happened, they turned off their headsets. And the next day, when they loaded back into Gorilla Tag, they were both banned for a day. This is the story of Mirror Man, Gorilla Tag's weirdest ghost. The next story is about a ghost called Beginning. This happened the same way most of these stories start. 2 players were playing in forest. They thought they were completely alone, until suddenly, they heard a loud, ear-piercing cry. They had no idea where this came from, until they noticed a purple player on the bridge. They just assumed it was one of their friends, but then the player started to teleport around the branches, still letting out terrifying cries. But then, while they were chasing this weird ghost around, it teleported in front of one of the players. The player froze as soon as this happened. but then the ghost just disappeared. This was very weird, but something even weirder is about to happen. The other player started moving in a very robotic way. This player was being controlled by the ghost. They both got banned for a week, but this isn't the only story about this ghost. There's another one that is way creepier than this. It started by a random player getting banned. The story says they got banned because of false reports, but something very weird happened while this player was banned. As this player was staring at the banned screen, they suddenly heard a loud cry from Stump. Obviously, after hearing this, the player turned around, and there was a ghost standing right there in Stump. But when the player ran up to Stump to find it, the ghost wasn't there. When the player turned around, the ghost appeared again, this time in the treehouse. Remember, this was all happening while the player was banned, so something like this would usually be impossible. Again, when the player got up to treehouse, the ghost disappeared. This continued for a while, until the ghost permanently banned the player. The next story goes back to late 2022. A player was alone in the code Sren 18. This is usually very bad, because anything can join this code while you're alone. But the player really wanted to find a ghost, so he waited for about 15 minutes in the code, until suddenly he heard a loud cry. But this wasn't any normal cry, it was very loud and distorted. He heard it coming from the city map. So of course, he instantly ran over. He started looking around city, trying to find out where the noise came from. After searching for a while, he eventually found it, standing by the mirror. He had never seen a ghost like this before, so he decided to approach it, having no idea what was about to happen. As soon as he walked up to the ghost, he started lagging a lot. Then the ghost turned to look at him, and it started chasing him. He quickly ran over to the computer to leave the code. Luckily, he escaped the code before the ghost caught him. A few minutes later, he joined the code again, and the ghost wasn't there. This is the story of the ghost tier liner, one of the creepiest Gorilla Tag ghosts ever. The next story is from earlier this year. A player was in a lobby with a few friends. They decided to go down to mines to spawn Lucy, but when they got down there, something was weird. Lucy was already there, even though no one spawned her. They assumed it was just a glitch, but then it happened again. No one was near the room, but Lucy still spawned in again. This happened over and over again. Each time it would get more hostile. At this point, they thought it was still a glitch, until it banned one of the players. It was clear now that this wasn't Lucy, it was a ghost. After this happened, they all ran out of caves, but the story doesn't end there. Whenever the players joined the code, the ghost would follow them. Sometimes they would just hear footsteps while alone in the code, but rarely they would see this ghost running around the code, each time having a different color. This forced them to completely abandon the code. This is the story of the ghost Mimic, a Gorilla Tag ghost that can mimic things from inside the game, and it could be hiding anywhere. The next story is about one of the most famous Gorilla Tag ghosts in Gorilla Tag history. This started with a player joining the code Daisybell. This is a code for the ghost Daisy09. When the player joined, he was completely alone. He had never found a ghost before, so he really wanted to find one. He searched every map, but after almost an hour of searching, he didn't find anything. This was kind of disappointing for him, because he spent ages looking, and literally nothing happened in the code. At this point, he was ready to leave, so he walked over to the computer, but he noticed something weird. It said there were 2 players in the lobby. This was weird because he hadn't heard anyone join, and that's when he heard it. Daisybell started to play. When he looked out into forest, he didn't see anything at first, but then he saw it. Standing in treehouse was Daisy09. He had no idea what to do. Since he had never seen a ghost before, he didn't know if he should run away or try to approach it. Eventually, he decided to walk over to it. As he got closer, the music got more distorted. When he finally made it to the treehouse, the ghost was standing right in front of him, not moving. It was just standing there like some kind of bot. Since it wasn't doing anything, he was about to leave the code, but when he left treehouse, the ghost started following him. At this point, he was very scared, because he had no idea what this ghost was going to do. He tried running into Stump, but he wasn't quick enough. As soon as the ghost caught him, his game black screened. He was scared, so he turned off his headset, and when he got back on Gorilla Tag the next day, he was permanently banned. This next story is the scariest one so far. There was a player joining random city lobbies. Everything was normal, until he joined a specific lobby. The lobby seemed normal at first, until he looked at the code he was in, hide. This was weird because it was a public lobby, so a code like this was a crazy coincidence. After seeing this, he ran to city to tell everyone, but everyone in the lobby was crowded around the mirror. Obviously, the player was curious about what was happening, so he walked over, and that's when he saw it. Statue, standing by the mirror, completely still. He was amazed by this because this was the first ghost he's ever seen, but the ghost started playing a corrupted audio. Then suddenly, the ghost started walking towards the player, but something was not right here. The other players in the lobby were still crowding at the mirror, not even noticing the ghost had moved. It was almost like they thought it was still there. The player started to move away, but it was too late. As soon as the ghost caught him, his game froze. But this isn't the scariest part. His screen completely froze, meaning if he turned his head, the screen would be frozen in place. But he could still hear the ghost. He could still see the ghost moving, but he couldn't do anything. He watched as the ghost did this to everyone. It was almost like he died, and was stuck watching everything happen through the eyes of a player that doesn't exist.